Hafaday. Thank you all for coming to today's hearing. The Committee on Health, Tourism, Historic Preservation, Land, and Justice is now called to order. Today's Tuesday, December 10, 2019. The time is 5:07 p.m. Notices for this public hearing were disseminated via email to all senators and all main media broadcasting outlets on Tuesday, December 3rd, and again on Thursday, December 5th, 2019. The notice was also published in the Guam Daily Post on December 3rd and 5th, 2019. Today we are going to receive an update on the negotiation of a new programmatic agreement, which we are going to be referring to as a PA, between the Department of Defense and the Guam State Historic Preservation Office to ensure protection of Guam's cultural and historic properties in the Mariana Islands training and testing areas. I'd like to thank my colleagues for attending this hearing, beginning with my Vice Chair, Senator Sabina Perez, Senator Kelly Marsh Taitano, and Senator James Moylan. I'd also like to thank those present, including former Senator Carlotta Leon Guerrero, and our State Historic Preservation Officer, Patrick Lujan, and our state archaeologists, John Mark Joseph, and Ms. Vera Pasta from the Guam Build-Up Office. Thank you all for being here. In 2009, when the military was pursuing one of the largest, if not the largest, military training and testing areas, the National Historic Preservation Act required consultation with Guam as to the impacts of the activity on historic properties. So Guam and the Department of Defense entered into a programmatic agreement to replace the individual consultations that would have been required for each training activity. We refer to this as the 2009 MERC PA, MERC standing for the Mariana Islands Range Complex. The 2009 PA was signed for Guam by Joseph Duenas, who was then the director of the Department of Parks and Recreation. I've read some background on this PA, and it seems that there was very little public input on those negotiations. And thus public input was not incorporated into that document. No other representative from Guam was a signatory to that agreement, including the then State Historic Preservation Officer. The State Historic Preservation Officers are charged in Guam law with protection of our historic properties and resources and preventing harm to them. State Historic Preservation Officers are also charged by federal law with many duties, including one that provides that they will be the signatory on programmatic agreements, or they will participate in consultations under the National Historic Preservation Act. Subsequent to those circumstances, the legislature tried to ensure that the SHPO would be a classified position and therefore not subject to transfer or other political interference. In 2010, Guam negotiated another programmatic agreement for one of the largest peacetime military activities, the relocation of the Marines to Guam and the creation of additional live fire training ranges and other activities. While that PA, we call that the 2010 relocation PA, had great public interest and the SHPO had allowed for public participation, in the end, only the governor and the SHPO made that decision. SHPO was a signatory, and then there were some other parties afterward who also became signatories, including the Guam Preservation Trust and the Department of Chamorro Affairs for Guam. It is my intention with this public hearing and in requesting from our State Historic Preservation Officer, which we call the SHPO, S-H-P-O, SHPO, we're requesting additional ways to incorporate public input. It's our intent that Guam will not be shorted in its negotiations, and that this rare and singular opportunity that Guam has to have input into the military's activities here will result in a document that truly protects Guam's historic and cultural properties and our environment from the adverse impacts of live fire training and testing in our lands and waters. We want to make sure that we make every effort to engage the public, experts, both subject matter and legal, and others who are interested in these historic properties as we move forward into this new programmatic agreement, to ensure as much as possible that we do avoid, minimize, and mitigate the impacts. The 2009 programmatic agreement on the MERC, the Mariana Islands Range Complex, was extended in 2015, or it was used in 2015 when the MERC was converted to the MIT, the Mariana Islands Training and Testing Area. This programmatic agreement, which began in 2009, is set to expire in December 2019. And so the Department of Defense and our Guam representatives have been in negotiations for a new one. The participants in the Section 106 process, according to the National Historic Preservation Act, shall include the agency official, which in this case is the Department of Defense, and the State Historic Preservation Officer, and other consulting parties as determined by the Department of Defense. So we are here today to discuss this MERC PA that will be transformed into a new MIT PA, which will resolve the consultation, or is intended to resolve the consultation that is required between the military and the government of Guam, or Guam, for its training and testing activities pursuant to this MERC. If we could ask the SHPO, Mr. Patrick Lujan, to please have a seat, and anyone else actually who's interested in testifying, please come and have a seat. I thank you to Joe Kanata from the Director of the Guam Preservation Trust, who's also here. If it's okay with you, I have a couple slides that just show in general the maps so that people can follow along if that's... so this is the Mariana Islands Training and Testing Area. It encompasses the islands of Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and if you can see the water, huge expanse of water. It is the red line, that's more of a square, was the original MERC. And then the light blue, stretched out rectangle is what expanded in 2015 to the MIT Training and Testing Area. Next slide. This map also has a light blue line that shows the MIT area, the MIT outline. It's a light blue line. But it also, so in here, it has other like geological features, such as the vents, the banks, and of course the islands. And just wanted to show that the area that's encompassed in that light blue line in the MIT Mariana Island Training and Testing Area. Next slide. This is the island of Guam, and those words and arrows show points of, if I understand correctly, these are detonation areas. One of them is at Pearl Harbor, one of them is off of Agate, but there are some that are further out. Next slide. This is Pearl Harbor, and this map is a little hard to see, but there are maps. So if you see the circles, look at the orange circle. That's a detonation area inside the harbor. The yellow extended area, I believe, is another one of those areas. There are other components in this map, but it's too small. I can see from here that we'll go to the next slide. All right, so there are maps here. Maybe Patrick, later on, we can talk about these. These are the maps that were provided to us by the Department of Defense that show, go to the next map, This show the historic properties and the locations of those historic properties that they expect might be affected by the MERC and now by the MIT. Next map. I'm just going to get an overview of these. There were 3, I think. Next slide. This is Naval Ordnance Area. That first one was Anderson. This is Naval Ordnance Area. Next slide. And this is Apra Harbor again. Okay, sorry, I wished it was bigger on the screen, but the codes tell us exactly where the historic properties are in these maps, so they're marked. Okay. Let me see the next slide. These are the types of training and testing that they have announced will take place in our lands and waters. Under the MIT. Next slide. All right, this is a 106 process. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. All right. Okay, if we could go back to the activities that are allowed. Thank you. We'll just leave that slide up, and you can go back and forth to that once in a while, but right now we can go to Mr. Lujan. All right, Mr. Lujan, if you could, you're the acting State Historic Preservation Officer. Could you please explain to us what you think we all need to know regarding the difference between the 2009 MERC and the PA that was negotiated then and what we are trying to do in our 2020 MIT programmatic agreement, or PA?
Sure. Thank you for the invitation, Senator Terlaje. Thank you for the 3 ladies who have always been, concerned about this issue and still remain concerned to this day. Thank you, Senator Moreland, for joining us this evening. So with the 10-year expiration of the MERC PA that's soon to expire this month, we've been in consultation with the Department of Navy for about a 12 months period already, going over about 4 or 5 consultation sessions, and then long distance communications with them within. And so I think the biggest points to take from where that PA has been and where we're taking the next PA, obviously is the reporting mechanisms that were not in place prior to that. Now we have to have a baseline study prior to any movement. There's 16 sites that are named in the programmatic agreement. So basically, it's not new sites that will be coming up in the new agreement, but how can we get the reporting, accurate in an annual basis, sometimes in a quarterly basis, especially if exercises are to take place. And then another big step was the cultural sensitivity training that we will be implementing in the new programmatic agreement for the troops that will be coming to Guam and using these areas. I have looked at their preliminary data as far as foot traffic is concerned within the last couple of years. Out of the 16 sites, there were, where's that? So only 7 out of the 16 sites that had kind of a, I don't know if you would call it significant, but over 100 people that were involved within a calendar year at 7 of the 16. The other 9 sites were, probably an average of a dozen. And those are just preliminary indicators that I see. But we've really have dove deep into every section of the new draft that has been made available to your offices in regards to that. Another thing is really, the public forums that we've had, this being one, having the public aware of what's going on, the transparency of the process that we're having, and then finally the partnership that we have with the governor's office and the attorney general's office to have a fine-tooth comb legal review that wasn't done 10 years ago. So we're pretty pleased with that, having an attorney assigned to this to actually look through it from a legal sense.
All right. What is the difference between the 2009 MERC and the 2020 MIT? The MIT has undergone in 2019 a supplemental EIS.
Mm-hmm.
They intend to give us the final, I guess, supplemental EIS in March 2020 was their original estimate, and that they were going to proceed with a record of decision, meaning a decision to act and allow this Mariana Islands training and testing area in the summer of 2020. So what would be the difference between the MERC activities or even the 2010 activities and the 2015 activities and these 2020 MIT activities?
Yeah, as far as the activities, I don't know. I don't have the details on that as far as the military activities. What we do have that we see within the programmatic agreement is exactly what type of traffic can go near the perimeters or within the areas of potential effects of the historic sites. And that's described as far as what types of vehicles can go within those areas and foot traffic. So those have been defined as far as exact activities. They haven't provided us with exact details with that. What we're concerned of is basically the impact of these historic sites that are close to it.
Are you able to ascertain the impacts from the 2009 MERC activities on historic sites?
Yes. So they have provided me a draft. It's not their final. I've been pushing for some type of data to analyze and study. So that's where I came about with the effects of how many people have been going to these assigned training areas. And so, as I mentioned, 7 of the 16 identified sites have had over 100 personnel within a calendar year.
Did you say 716?
7 out of 16
oh,
sites,
okay.
yes.
So what is that document? Because when we've been having meetings regarding this programmatic agreement with the Department of Defense, they've announced meetings, and I know that the Preservation Review Board has attended, your office has attended, the Governor's Build-Up Office has attended, the Preservation Trust has attended, but they were never able to provide in those meetings any type of report on the 2009 or the 2015 MIT activities, what the impacts of those activities were on historic properties. But you have a report now?
I have a preliminary report, so I'm still awaiting their final report. So I just wanted to review, some data that they are, I guess they're not done compiling it, but I was able to get a hold of just at least a piece of that study so I can take a look at it. So I don't think it's ready for all of us stakeholders to look at. I'll push for them to get it done as soon as possible.
So you would not be willing to provide that copy to anyone here?
It's
The
an
reason
FOU.
I'm asking because
Yeah.
in your last letter to me, you said that that this document that you've been negotiating is almost final and that you're hoping to get it to final in March 2020. And if that's the case, yeah,
I hope so.
it's sounding like cart before the horse to me if we're not even able to assess the impacts of the prior training and testing on our historic sites as to how we're going to be able to, we need to know how we're going to be able to protect them going further. I think that was one of the first concerns brought up by Senator Carlotta León in one of those early meetings with Department of Defense.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I'm optimistic, so I'm hoping by March, but we'll see how the process goes. I'm not trying to push it or rush it, but it behooves us to get a good agreement in place, especially,
All right, could you describe then the report, what it includes? What does it say that it includes?
So it goes by personnel, what type of exercise it was, and then what type of training, touch and go aircraft, helicopter training. So, and then I think the reason why it's still in draft and not ready to be presented, it's because I requested for more years of data, and they were only available only to extract the last couple of years. So until we complete the entire picture, then we can actually do a really good analysis of the impact of what had happened over the last 10 years.
All right, do they do any analysis of the impact on historic sites besides telling you how much traffic was in the area or what type of activities? Have
Right.
they assessed these historic sites?
Right now, that's not part of the information that I've gotten.
All right, okay, so a new programmatic agreement, the new MIT, they want to renew their MIT in 2020 and renew a programmatic agreement in 2020. Their goal has been stated that they need permits to conduct these activities from entities such as Fish and Wildlife and other entities. One of the permits that was given to them in 2010 and extended into 2015, for example, from the National Fish and Wildlife, allowed 12,580 detonations per year. That was the kind of details that these permits lay out that seem to have eluded us prior to that. So the permits are very clear about how much activities they are allowed to do. They predict how the impact, and so Fish and Wildlife, of course, predicts impact to fish and wildlife. They were predicting impacts to dolphins and whales of 81,962 takings of 26 different dolphin and whale species. And so those numbers are very shocking to me, but I'm wondering if we have some kind of analysis like that for historic sites. So we know now that they had predicted 16 sites to be potentially affected by the MERC or MIT training. And in the 2015 or 2020 training going forward, you're saying, do you agree with their summation that only 16 sites will be affected?
That's how it's been from the 2009. Everything else that has type of any other activity that's outside of what has been the MERC has gone through your regular Section 106 consultation. So everything that encompasses within the 16 sites falls under the programmatic agreement, and then whatever does not fall under that goes through the Section 106, which has been happening.
All right. The supplemental EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, for the 2020 MIT has yet to be completed. Do you think that negotiations for the programmatic agreement should be put on hold until we can see what that supplemental environmental impact statement includes?
Senator, just on this point, it's something that was raised by both of us in a workshop, as well as I think somebody from one of the legislative staffers when we last had a programmatic agreement workshop. And then there's language on page 2 of this draft where they note that this PA would apply as well as to the MIT SEIS that is still in draft form and its resulting ROD. So to me, I put next to this a legal question: can a draft document like this process be included, or do we amend it later? So the question that you're raising is a question that we're raising with our legal counsel, that we're raising with, that we'll raise with the Attorney General, but it was also noted, it would probably be in the minutes, because it was in the programmatic workshop, and it was brought up by several people at that meeting. So that has been flagged. We're not exactly sure what the answer to that is, but it has been noted and flagged, and we have a period of time to drill down and get this programmatic agreement right. So that's one of the details that's flagged right here.
Yes, well, that was the first thing I think brought up in one of the meetings with the Department of Defense, was that we were in the middle at that time of commenting on
Right.
the SEIS. And so we have learned from the 2010 relocation PA, which was signed before they determined where the live fire training ranges were even going to be, because they hadn't done the supplemental EIS for the live fire training ranges. And that was one of the big issues that we continue to get frustrated by, that the PA said it would cover all other activities, not even assessed yet. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping we're not going to do, is say we are going to, by this PA, agree that this will be the process without knowing the actual impacts that we might be, or even activities that might be allowed.
It is of concern to us also.
I'm thinking that the SEIS will show us with more detail the frequency of the activity to be expected in this 2020 MIT. It's an expansion. And one of the things that they said they were going to do, the differences between the prior PA and the new PA, or the prior MIT and the new MIT, was going to be increase in the frequency of some activities, right? All right. I want to go into the details of the difference in the MIT, but I would like to ask you, the current PA is set, programmatic agreement is set to expire this month. What is the status of have you entered into an interim PA?
We have. We've basically taken the exact language from the 2009 to buy us time into a 6-month interim programmatic agreement. It's pretty much an extension of the existing while we work on the new one. But because the original one had the CNMI as a co-signator, and they are not in this, so we have to call it an interim programmatic agreement. So it takes us to June, with hopes of the new MIT to be finalized prior to June. And so we worked through front office and the legal reviews there to proceed with the interim.
Who were the signatories on that interim PA?
It was myself as a SHPO,
For Guam.
correct.
Who were the signatories for Guam?
Myself,
Okay.
yes.
So the only difference was that it separated the CNMI, which had been included in our Mariana Islands training and testing range since 2009. We have been joined together in this training and testing in our waters.
Yes.
It's been separated, and I know that is over the objection of some senators at the early meetings with Department of Defense. And but I guess by signing it, you have agreed to the separation of the CNMI and Guam.
Well, there's some standing conflict, I would say, between the CNMI and the Department of Navy. So what has happening up there, I think that they're also trying to, it's at a different consultation and negotiation level. So in this sense, for us to proceed with what we're focusing on the Guam side, this buys us time while we work on the MIT.
Senator, if I could add to this, the concerns that were brought to me by our senators about splitting up the programmatic agreement, I took that to our governor, who said, run it by the CNMI, see how they feel about this. So I just wanted you to know that we tried. And so I had conversations with the governor's office, and the governor came back and said that they felt that this was the best thing for the CNMI, that they wanted to go this course, and they said, we're asking that Guam please respect our wishes on this. It was very clear and unequivocal coming from the CNMI. It was, if we have split, it's because the CNMI asked to go their own way.
And Guam agreed. It's a negotiated agreement by the SHPO.
Yeah. Well, it takes one party to disagree to annul the programmatic agreement. So.
All right, and I guess I'm sure those concerns will be discussed in a little while. Does the interim PA allow a renewal of permits?
Again, it's taken straight from the 2009. So all the new mechanisms that we are working on, it's not in it. It's just strictly buys us time until the new.
But does it buy them time on their permits also? In other words, are they allowed to extend their permits, which also expire, and conduct the training and testing? Yes.
Senator, if I may, I'm not sure on the
Could you
Fish
just
and
state
Wildlife.
your name for the
I'm
record
sorry,
so it's
John
recorded?
John Mark Joseph, State Archaeologist.
Thank you.
In dealing with historic properties, I can't speak to Fish and Wildlife. That would be something that they would have to go along if they wanted to extend that permit or whatever. They have a permit to a certain time. I imagine that's to December 11th. And other than that, I'm sure the Navy will have to seek a new permit from them because that's when the PA ended. So I don't know of any extending of any permit for Fish and Wildlife, but I can't speak to those.
Right, well, I wish we knew that before we entered into an interim, what the ramifications of that are in regards to permitting. Permitting is really what they need here. They're not asking our permission to do these activities, but they do need permits from these other agencies, and our signing the PA allows them to pursue those.
Yeah, so just real quick, if we were not to have signed the interim PA for the extra 6 months, then upon the expiration, it would require them to go individual Section 106 requests, which would add already to our inundated workload just for that. So in this case, like I said, it buys us time with the existing agreements, though we have indicated that it could be better, which we're working on now. It will still be within our office. It just does away with those individual onesie twosie requests that will be coming in through from a Section 106 perspective.
Yes, but those individual requests would also be giving us then the details that we are now trying to get for the 2009 to 2019 activities, 10 years worth of activities that we need
the
details
request
on.
has already been in place, so we're awaiting the final. And so I'm actually.
There have been members of the Historic Preservation Review Board that have actively requested that individual consultations as required by the Historic Preservation Act are not necessarily that bad in an interim, but I see you disagree. But how many years is the proposed MIT going to cover, the new MIT, the new PA rather?
10 years.
10 years. Okay, so in our correspondence, you indicated that you're close to a final version. The interim expires when? In March?
June
June, okay.
June 30th.
And you indicated that you are close to a final version with a final consultation with DOD scheduled for mid-January and expect the new PA signed by March. Is this really the only chance, I guess, the people of Guam are going to get is this one more meeting in mid-January to affect this document?
No, ma'am. It's not set in stone. That's what the January consultation is set. But if it requires more and a little bit more time for review and for more comment, then we're open to that. So I'm just kind of like I said, I'm a little optimistic for March, but if it rolls into April or May, then that's okay as well.
Have you invited any of the Chamorro organizations or others that are interested in cultural heritage or protecting cultural sites to be consulting parties to this 106 process?
We have not, but we use you guys, the senators, as a representative of the public, and so we've taken all that information and from everybody else, but not specifically to direct groups.
Is there a reason that you are not inviting anyone? We know that the federal law for Guam does not dictate who will be invited to be a consulting party as far as like it does for for tribes. They dictate that tribes will be consulted. They dictate that Native Hawaiians will be consulted, and they lay out how that's going to happen. But for Guam, they do not have a process in place, so we've really been invited just because of the State Historic Preservation Officer inviting us, not necessarily DOD. And so, like, for the senators, I think we've put ourselves into the process because we've pursued it. But these other organizations, I don't think have that much. They're not invited, so they don't even know the meetings, except for what the PDN has put out. But that's not a regular, like right now. Mm-hmm. Do we know the date of the next meeting?
Not right now. Yeah, we're still talking about that.
So are you open to inviting more people to be consulting parties on
I
this
am.
106? For the 2010 PA for the relocation, there were several people interested, or organizations interested in being consulting parties, including We Are Guahan, Wet'suwet'en Famalawan, Nation Chamorro, I think the Tautomona Native Rights, but there were different, I think Pratehi Letexan might be interested, but I hope that you can expand your efforts to include the public, invite them to, it's really to influence your decision, because as we all have seen, it's the SHPO's decision that we are all going to have to live by. Even we as senators cannot change your decision. We can't stop you from signing an agreement that we think is bad. We can't do any of those things. And so it's really just a process to influence your knowledge of what you are signing and your, the implications. I think, if you invite them and you let them know what's going to be affected, they can bring in knowledge that, that will help our historic preservation efforts, I think. They will tell us they grew up there. They will tell us what they've used that place for, different things, or what else might be in the area, which is what DOD wants to know from us, right? What other historic sites might be in this area that they have not recognized yet. All right. The PA draft refers to a HABS, HABS, or Hayer documentation. Could you explain that, what that documentation is?
That is the... Where's the...
I don't know the page. Well,
I know what you're talking about, but
okay.
I'm trying to look at the reference.
It says it's been provided, but if you could also provide that document to us. Have you seen that document? Mike, could you please join us up here? Mike Makia, and chairperson of the Guam Historic Preservation Review Board.
Senator, are you talking about Northwest Field and the HABs done for
Well,
that?
this draft PA says the HABS Hayer documentation, but it's not attached. So.
Yeah, it's the Historic American Building Survey and the Historic American Engineering Record that was done, that was previously documented for Northwest Field. We've had several of those. One was done for the legislature building here.
All right, but is Northwest Field part of this PA, the MIT PA?
I'm sure it will be because it's mentioned here, yes.
Okay.
I know the THAAD is at Northwest Field. They will be doing certain exercises such as, perhaps helicopter landings on the airfield or whatever, on the pavement.
Yeah, it's part of it.
If they mess up the pavement, then they come back and they
Alright.
fix it with light type material.
All right, those are the Anderson activities that are in addition to the activities covered in the other programmatic agreement, including the live fire training range that they're building. Okay,
Correct. They will be totally different.
all right. The draft does not include appendices either. Are those available to you at this point?
Those are being finalized, so they're not final right now.
When you say these things are being finalized, does this mean you and the Department of Defense are agreeing to what these
No,
will be?
Those were based off the previous appendices that we felt that could be more detail, that we've been working on the previous consultation meetings. And so they've taken our comments and adding the detail to those, especially the maps. So we're still waiting for the delivery of those products.
Yeah, that is actually my main question, which I'm asking regarding the SCIS and the maps. So without the maps, how are we able to fully, consent to?
I really expect it to be ready for during the January consultation, or else there's really no use of holding a consultation if they're not done with those. So I'll definitely relay that message.
We're talking about the constraint maps, right? Which
Correct.
give us more detail on the APE.
Yes,
It's
ma'am.
what I hope will inform all of us in our comments.
Yeah. So yes, that's really that's going to provide even more details of what we're all looking for. And as you know, the previous maps that has been presented to us really wasn't detailed enough and leaves a lot of question. So
Okay, that point right there, that the previous maps were not detailed enough. That's why I'm asking you, were the 16 historic sites, are you satisfied that is an adequate showing of what potential sites are affected by this training? And I guess I was going to ask the state archaeologist if he had reviewed the constraint maps and if he's satisfied that they show adequately the historic properties that might be affected, and especially with the activity that they're planning to increase.
Senator, at present I haven't, but I guarantee you I will look over them with a fine-tooth comb and let the SHPO know if I have any problems with that. We had, when they did the interim PA, I saw one paragraph I didn't like and they took that out of the programmatic agreement for the interim, which was that they would do any construction at that. I didn't want to see that and didn't want to hear that because there are sites I know that we want to protect, we've asked them to protect, so we want to make sure that they do not do anything and have a oops before we make sure everything's written in stone.
Yes, if it's possible, when you receive the maps that you're supposed to receive for this consultation process, I would like for the public and for us to be able to discuss those and to hear from the archaeologists what other properties should be included or might be affected. Have there been any surveys done since 2009 to increase the listing of historic properties?
In certain areas, there's been, I can't say exactly to the constraint maps. I know that they have some ongoing now. They're going to run the baseline study, so we want to know exactly where they're going, what they're going to do, what historic properties are there, and how they may be affected. We don't want someone running down the road. We've got a laddie set there at 60 miles an hour in their truck. So there are certain aspects of the agreement we'll have to look at closely.
All right. The consultation process, in order for us to say whether, we object to these impacts, this type of an impact on this historic property, we have to know exactly which properties, exactly what activities they're going to be doing. And that's what I feel like there may be a gap here, that we're proceeding with a programmatic agreement without knowing that information solid. We don't have an assessment of the prior activity and the impact that it has had, and we don't have a detailed assessment of what may have been discovered since 2009 in these areas, what you expect to discover if an adequate survey is done, and what specific activity or increase in activity or cumulative impacts, which is another thing that the Senator Carlotta brought up very early in these discussions. Cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts is another reason why I'm concerned about this separation of Guam and the CNMI, because they're training and testing in the waters, and we are an archipelago, and obviously what happens in the waters of, Saipan and our Mariana Islands, I think, are going to have cumulative impacts on all of us. But it's another issue from the 2010 PA that we should learn from, that cumulative impacts were, we tried to predict them, but they were unpredictable at that time. We could not even predict the impact, so we guessed. And here we've had 10 years of activity, and so I'm hoping we can better assess the impacts.
Yes, I believe that's going to be the next stage. Obviously, is to really study the new impact maps and the data that we've been requesting them to provide. Leading up to this month or the last consultation meeting, it's been really focusing on the language of the programmatic agreement. Now it's the analysis of the history of the old programmatic agreement, and then making educated decisions of what that impact has done and how we can better the new programmatic agreement based off of that.
All right. I was going to ask you I have a lot more questions about specific topics, but I was going to ask you to just, if you could go through for us, and I've seen that the Guam Preservation Trust has submitted a document and I passed it out to the senators, it is a comparison of the 2009 MERC and the draft 2020 MIT PA. And so it lists what may have been not included this time, and then they've also put together a list of suggestions for the 2020 MIT PA. Now, I know that we've been having some meetings, trying to influence your decisions in this and trying to give you our suggestions also. It's one of the reasons why we contacted the Attorney General's office, hoping they would put their input up front, right, while we are preparing to negotiate, not just after it's been negotiated to review the document, but to help us to negotiate, to get better language to propose, better analysis. So how would you like to proceed, Mr. Lujan? Would you like to tell us the differences between the 2009 MERC and the 2020 MIT, in addition to what you've already stated?
Joe and his team actually put this together. So, and this is, I'm going to look at this as the first time as you would. So if I can go ahead and pass it over to Joe Kanata so he can explain the chart.
Thank you. Mr. Kanata, please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Joe Kanata, Chief Program Officer for Guam Preservation Trust. And as we received last week the updated draft programmatic agreement, we wanted to really look at it and dissect it to see, number one, because we have a lot of lessons learned from the 2010 PA. We want to make sure that if we are reading the 2020 PA, that it encompasses a lot of our lessons learned. We've had consultation meetings since early this year. We make suggestions. We wanted to know if those suggestions were in place. And so what we did was we laid out the 2010 MERC PA, and then we laid out the 2020 MIT PA, and we sort of compared to see whether any changes were made, whether there were add-ons, what could be our suggestions for the PA. But what it does is it gives you sort of an overview, but at the same time you can go to detail. And we want this to circulate so that people can write their suggestions, looking at the PA from lessons learned, 2010 to the 2020 the draft 2020 that we're putting, that's before us. So the other document that we sent out really were just suggestions by the Guam Preservation Trust and some other folks in meetings that had happened since early 2019. And these suggestions, again, or these prompt questions talk about things like the mapping, things like definitions on these words, what is measurable rather than just reasonably measurable. Things like that. Those are the things that we sort of caught on. And it's not something that we did a really complete, comprehensive review. It's a start so that we can pass it to the SHPO's office, pass it around to the different stakeholders. And if they feel that they should put some stuff into it to add on to these suggestions, or if they have an eye, the legal review have an eye on these, that they can be able to add on to that. So this is just something that we thought that everybody should look at and everybody should add on to.
Sidus Masi, what about as to the process overall then? Do you think we can do this? We can do as you have done. You've pretty much done a spreadsheet. I'm going to show everyone. It's a spreadsheet of comments and very helpful with specific suggestions. Any other way that you think that we can get the public to help in this?
Yeah, programmatic agreement, this whole process is very complicated. And where, the public is looking at the leaders and ourselves to make sure that we review it carefully, that we take note of these things and we learn from the past. And the public look to us to make sure that we do that. We're not depending on the public to do our work, and I think that we should all do the work together. It is, the PA is complicated. The PA should be reviewed by our leaders and our stakeholders. And do we have the time to do that? Again, that's something that we have to really look at. We don't have, and historically, that was one of the violations that the Guam Preservation Trust identified, was that the record of decision was signed before the PA was signed. And we got to make sure that the PA is signed, but we got to make sure that we have the information, informed information for us to take a look at the PA and be confident enough to sign that PA.
One of the items, this is just a story, but one of the best items included in the 2010 PA was the exclusion of POGET, and that was very much because of the public's input. And I think it was the public that helped the SHPO to come up with some of the language. Of course, with your offices, the expertise, but it's the public that really helps to influence this office that is doing the negotiation on our behalf.
Senator, if I could add to the point that Patrick and Joe were making, the governor's office is also drilling down into the documents, doing side-by-side comparisons, and the sort of thing that jumped out at me would be like, if I see deleted language, I was really looking for things like this, or if I saw things go from specific to vague. So I would really be looking for this. So an example, under this section here on training constraint maps, a sentence that was in the 2010 but is missing from the draft, deleted language said, training activities, when you take into account new survey studies or inadvertent and post-review finds, this is what's been deleted. Training activities may be eliminated, reduced, or expand based on new data. So that phrase is gone. So that would be something that I would be talking with the SHPO and legal counsel and others about, on the significance of a phrase like that. Why was it there? Why is it gone? So when I look at, everybody's looking at it with different eyes. And mine is, like I said, when it goes specific to vague, or when language is eliminated entirely. And so that's a phrase, just to give you an idea of what we're looking for also. So in addition, I appreciate Joe saying that, you know, we're all going to be doing our jobs. And I just wanted to give you an idea of what my perspective is and what I'm going after in looking at this. And I also want to say, in dealing with the SHPO, in all meetings, he's inviting all agencies, everybody, stakeholders that are there to give input to him. And so I've been appreciating working with him on language. This is the first he's heard from me on this one. So
That's one of the reasons why I'm having this hearing. It's
Yes.
because we've been attending the meetings with the Department of Defense, thinking that we are going to, on the Guam side, come up with an agreement that we all, you know, have contributed to, we all agree with, that we can support. We're going to help the SHPO to support that. But yet the language continues to change in these drafts that we've received in this current language. For example, I think that phrase, I also have that on my list of phrases that I want to know. So are these agreements that have already been made that we are now at this draft? Have you, for example, like when you agreed to separate Guam and CNMI, are these also agreements that we are bound by at this point, this language changes that we have all been able to see?
Nothing is bound at this time. It's still going through consultation. Every word and every sentence could be changed and reconfigured. So, you know, I can tell you that there's been, you know, some hard work put into this up to this latest draft that we have in place. But we're always open. I'm always open to, you know, from the front office and Carlotta to Joe and you as senators, taking your comments and taking it into consideration and see how this could be the best possible programmatic agreement we can have for the island. So nothing is set in stone. You know, I do have my vision and when I would like for this to, and I don't want it to draw out any, you know, much longer than it should, because even if we were to take this draft as we speak, it's so much better than what we're working off of today. So the sooner we can get this finished, the better we would be in position, because we can start implementing a lot of these things that we are adding to the new programmatic agreement that the 2009 version was not required to do.
Well, I hope the standard is much higher than just being better than 2009, because
Sure.
we have a lot of activity that we have had to go through your office and really we have been stuck by not being able to stop projects. You know, we've seen this process. We see the PA and what it ends up with. It pretty much gives us a time to review, and then they proceed. And we've seen this with burials, everything, that they are able to data recover in the end. And so I'm hoping for you know, bigger changes. I'm just concerned that if you are trying to secure this document as quickly as possible, you have not invited input from the public to your processes. You know, I'd like to go through the details of what you have come up with and ask you why. You know, I want to know, why do you think that is better than what we were doing, or better than what we could do? But I'm going to, I guess I'm going to ask the other senators some questions and see whatever's not covered. We'll come back to a few details. Is there anyone else on that panel that would like to add to this before we proceed? Yes.
If I may, Senators, just right now, everything is still out because, excuse me, we do not have the baseline studies we've asked for and all that. So right until they start making those and getting those to us, they said they'd have them to us before January, or at least a way to move forward with the baseline studies. But I don't think the SHPO will be signing until we make sure that all the studies are completed and we know exactly what's going on and where it is, and we have those studies done of the historic properties.
All right. Senator Kelly Marsh. Harrison.
Sujuis Masi for coming out here this evening. It's very important to be hearing from all of you. This does need to be a concerted effort. It does need to be something that as much of the community is providing their input into. And so I very much am interested in inviting others that have a vested interest, they've expressed interest over the years, to provide some input as well. So with the bifurcation of the PA agreement, or the separation of it, we have a connected history, we have connected sites, connected environment, and therefore impacts that can cross those political boundaries. And we've talked about cumulative effects. They can happen within our island, but certainly within the archipelago. Now, I respect NMI's position, and it seems to me that we have two political entities that have the same ancestral roots, and that they've been forced to be divided. And for me, at least, it feels like a form of divide and conquer, and so it's respecting CNMI, but it feels like that's the position that we've been put into, that we each have to fight for our survival and fight to do well. And unfortunately, that's the point where we're at right now. So I'd like to ask the Guam Historic Preservation Officer, what is our ability to view the Northern Mariana Islands PA agreement before we finalize ours? And even if they are going to be two separate documents, is there the opportunity to collaborate between us? Because I think as many heads that are looking at this, the better off we are. They may have thoughts or experiences that have not occurred to us, and vice versa. And that was some of what I hoped we would give each other or provide each other through a united PA, is that we could be here for each other, we could support each other if they needed technical expertise, or we needed to hear from their experience, that those channels perhaps would be open to that. So getting back to the question though, do we have an ability to see NMI's agreement and its features and the different ways that it's spelled out, or at least be working with them before we finalize ours?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Ms. Carlotta has just informed me that she has been providing all of our documentations and information to the government of the CNMI. As far as from the SHPO's perspective, I've been in contact with Ms. Rita Chung from the CNMI, my counterpart, on some other issues, but I was hoping that we would, last week during the World Heritage Workshop, all of the islands, the Pacific Islands were on island, and we got together to talk about the similarities and all the challenges that we have from a HPO standpoint. However, CNI was the only one that didn't come. So we'll re-engage with that, trying to build a structure within the islands, not just Guam and CNMI, but all of the islands, and we're even asking for Hawaii to come and join us into that group. That way we can collectively see, what we can do as a whole, and not just the Mariana Islands.
It's good to hear that there's that open communication, because there is a lot for us to be learning from each other. We're each experiencing somewhat different colonization and somewhat different impacts due to a variety of conditions. And I too was able to have some discussion with one of the representatives from the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so I think the more that we're open to hearing from others and collaborating with others, we can only be stronger from it. So I would like to encourage that we continue reaching out to the NMI SHPO and see if, even though the agreements themselves will be separate, but that we can still be here for each other to strengthen each of our agreements. And I'd like to know, this is building on some of the earlier statements. Well, actually, before I move on to that, so if I could have former Senator Carlota Leon Guerrero let us know which government officials you've been in communication with. Have they been the Historic Preservation Office, or has it been related agencies?
Glenna Rages and Angel Demapon. Angel Demapon is the Chief of Staff, and Glenna Rages is in charge of their military buildup, and she's the governor's military advisor as well. She's a combination of me and Vera. And she's also the one that's dealing with the programmatic agreement from the governor's office, dealing with Rita Chong, the SHPO. So her relationship with Rita is the same as me and Patrick.
So Masi for that information. And so getting back to building on some of the statements that were provided earlier, I had pushed for that even if the other side, being NMI, was asking for a separation, that we at least make a statement that it made sense to us to keep it together. Did we indeed make a statement in that regard, or did we just accept? Because I think that there's importance in documenting our preferences or our positions. Was there any statement made that we could see value in staying together to the military that were setting up this PA?
I conveyed your concerns to the governor, and the governor felt strongly enough about it to say, let's run it by Ralph. Call the governor in the CNMI and let him know how we're feeling. And then when we got back the unequivocal, please respect our wishes on this, that's pretty strong language, governor to governor. Then Governor Leon Guerrero said, okay, then I will respect his wishes on that. And that's as far as we went. We didn't make any public statements, if that's what you're asking, public statements of our concern of wanting to stay together, other than the governor conveying that to the CNMI governor.
Well, and I do appreciate hearing that. We tried to make a strong stand for it and for it to be something to be considered, to hear our...
It was definitely considered.
Issues. And I do appreciate that. But for interacting with the military, because they're the ones who are doing the actual drafting, was there any sentiment from the SHPO or anyone else to the military that we could see some value in it staying together?
So I've spoken to the negotiators of the Department of Navy in this sense, and I've also reiterated having that cultural similarity between Guam and CNMI, and how things are aligned from a cultural standpoint with CNMI and Guam, but with the focus of exact sites, in our case, the 16 locations, it's either way you go, whether have it holistically or have it just solely, for me, it's more manageable if it's by itself, with ourselves. Because if you look at the original programmatic agreement, you had both parties, but any type of movement or any type of amendments to the programmatic agreement would require the other party to also be a signature too. So in that sense, when it comes to a management standpoint, then it's easier to manage if it's by itself. But I am in support of what, from a cultural standpoint, and having that that alignment of having both, you know, being visible to one another. And I think in what you mentioned about us working closely with CNMI, I have all intentions of doing so with Ms. Rita and her staff. But to my understanding, you know, they're still trying to clear things up there that, you know, needs to be ironed out.
And some of my concerns are also with the cumulative effects. I mean, it's much more transparent if it's all together in one document. And there have been problems between DEISs, EISs, SEISs, and records of decisions where they refer to one another rather than being clear and understandable within one document. And so I do think that there are some issues, but again, it's beyond our complete decision here. So when looking at the MIT PA particulars, just to make sure that I have the most updated understanding. So I know that there had been some discussion about when artifacts are found and what the protocol and the standard operating procedure would be. And so I believe we advocated for the same process that we have during the build-up activities, meaning there's a pause to the exercise, that the SHPO be informed, and so I have read about those being in there. I think these are all reasonable. We're talking about ancestral sites or historical sites, and they deserve to be treated with respect. So do you feel that all those necessary steps are now in there? If you could outline. So the exercise is paused, but it was unclear to me when I was reading if it continued to be paused while the SHPO was being informed, and whether it continued to be paused while they were determining eligibility, and whether it continued to be paused during some of these different steps. So if you could perhaps outline the process in general and let us know if it has included all of the elements that have been discussed this far from different stakeholders.
What particular area is that, if you can help us make reference? I know what you're talking about, but for...
Let me find
Thank you.
one of them, because it comes up at some different points.
Yeah, for the archaeological portion, I'll refer to the state archaeologist, but our mindset when we were starting to massage this is basic, you know, taking our experience from the 2011 programmatic agreement and the lessons learned so far of what we've been going through within the office, and assuring that that relationship, even though it's a different location and a different programmatic agreement, is in the new one. So yes, we've learned some lessons with the existing 2011 programmatic agreement that will be reflected into this one.
So in the section 5, discoveries and emergencies, this is one of the areas where it shows up. And as has been mentioned, and so I'm very glad that the Guam Preservation Trust has picked up on some of that terminology and needing to have some understanding about what reasonable is and appropriate, and some of those sort of terms, which show up right here, which is why I mentioned them. But I would also ask for the clarity, because, as I said, it's unclear. They talk about that all activities within the immediate area will be halted when a cultural resource is discovered. And then it talks about reasonable measures to avoid. And so then it's unclear if that halt remains in effect for all the other steps. And so I would recommend that we make that very clear of understanding in each of these steps. Is it still halted, or did they just halt in order to determine how to avoid it and then move back to the exercise while the other steps are taking place? So in the next part, it talks about discovery and determining eligibility. in the determining eligibility, although we do have professionals that are involved, there can be real differences between indigenous and local perspectives, and so that would be one of the areas I'd like to see SHPO input in to. And then they talk about resolving and taking into account these sort of things, and then they continue to go through steps. But do you feel that all the steps and all those lessons learned, that the halting, the being notified by having the SHPO be notified within 48 hours, again, that was a little unclear to me when that 48-hour time period started. And I wasn't really sure why it would take 2 days either. But to please just check those steps and make sure that everything that you've learned or that you think is prudent on our behalf is in there. Yes.
Senator, there is a step that I would like to add to the process of discoveries, and that is what happens with all of the fragments. And from what I have learned is if you maybe 400 fragments come up, but they're going to study the ones that have a rim, the ones that have a curve, the ones that have a base that might have some residue in it, and the ones that have markings. All the other ones that would not be kept for study. And in one of the programmatic agreements, it says it's up to the contractor to dispose of it. I would like that to go to CAHA. I think that all of them would be precious to us without the markings and the edges. And I think if it went to CAHA for our artists to turn it into, create something out of it so that we can have this and not feel that it has slipped away from us. So that's the step that I have been thinking about as we're going through these different meetings, when we're in the programmatic workshops and we're all bouncing off of each other. That's the sort of thing that, to think about what could be added and for what reason and why. And that's mine, that I would like to see added.
And I think suggestions like that, or recommendations, or desires like that are important to hear. I know at the annual workshop that we had last year, I believe it was, for the programmatic agreement on Guam, there was some discussion about that. Part of the issue that they brought up was once they have discovered it, all of a sudden there are these I'm not sure what the right term is, but these different elements that come into play that they are now responsible for it at this professional standard. But that being said, I think if it's spelled out in the PA and this is an agreement between us, that it might be able to say that that could indeed happen because we're going to relieve them of that federal responsibility. So perhaps it could be written in there. Did anybody else want to speak on that? I know, John Mark, you were there during that part of the meeting.
Yes, Senator, if I may, where she is talking about deals with the 2011 programmatic agreement, and that is a totally different agreement than this one. Here we're looking to avoid any historic properties in any way, shape, or form. What I can say is that there is kind of a conflict with the using of artifacts that come from archaeological sites, because then it opens it up for others to perhaps visit sites that are not, have not been looked at and are not significant, and therefore to gather artifacts from those. So it is in error ethics not to do certain things. It is up to the SHPO, though, that and written in the laws for the movement of any artifacts. It is up to him and his signature for that. So that given said, there may be a way that we can do this and do it as a community to bring it together. I know Mr. Joe Garrido one of my staff has been very vocal in doing this as far as perhaps collecting them and building a wall to show the power and the presence of those artifacts that are not being collected, and how much time and energy and all went into that, and something that may be displayed for the community of Guam to see. I've thought very dearly of that idea, since those artifacts will be and are being grinded up back into the soil as we speak. Otherwise, historic pottery a lot of times has been used in other pottery, and that's another thing throughout time. So there's a lot of ideas, and we hope people will come forward with those suggestions to where we can perhaps get something moving on this as we move forward.
I appreciate your sharing that. I was there when Mr. Garrido was mentioning some of those concerns of his and interests, but I had not yet heard of the possibility of the wall. And I think that is something where it could bring those artifacts together where they could be appreciated without encouraging perhaps
Looting.
well,
Yeah.
without encouraging people's getting confused about what the laws are and what the protections are, because certainly we don't want anybody to be confused out there. So please continue to have him push for that or explain it to us so that we understand that. So for the SHPO, are you aware of required elements of the current MIT-PA that the military has not met? So certainly you've mentioned lessons learned. The maps are not detailed enough. It seemed to me that some of the reporting has yet to be accomplished. Are there required elements of the current PA that the military has not met?
Yeah, we're just waiting for the constraint maps and the baseline surveys. So I've already notified them that there's no signing of any document until those are delivered to our office, and so we can have a really good study of those.
Okay, and so I think I was confusing when I said current PA. So the one that's in effect until the end of the year for that PA, not the upcoming one, for the PA that we've been following for the last several years. Are there elements of that have not been met? Reports that haven't been finished, documentation that didn't occur?
Yeah, there was hardly any reporting that was required to begin with. So that was one of the first things that we've identified that needs to be changed right away. So they're in line with that, and they're in agreement that should be done.
And do they have a record in other aspects that you feel confident that they will be able to keep up with that level of reporting?
Well, the 2011 PA is an indicator with the annual meetings that they have. So since I've been back in the office, I haven't been a part of those yet. So I can't really get into detail with that.
And so I'm just throwing in a comment here, because we here, including all of you that are here testifying today, since we all here represent the rights of the people of Guam and protection of them, a lot of times Western federal law does not recognize indigenous heritage very well, or protect it very well, or recognize all of that is associated with it. In fact, for those federal regulations, Section 106 and so forth, they are being rewritten because they have some major flaws. So I would encourage all of us to not be limited by federal regulation and say, well, they've met the letter of the law, because it does not capture the intent of the law oftentimes. And certainly it doesn't necessarily capture what ancestral heritage means to the indigenous peoples. For example, the deadline at NICTAMS, because a deadline was imposed, that doesn't serve the best needs of the Chamorro people and their ancestral heritage because a deadline was not captured. And so this is where I have called upon the military, but all of us, of course, to be more proactive, that they have a duty, in my eyes, to be more proactive, to not just let a deadline pass, to come and go. But with that, it seems to me when I've been reading through this that the ACHP, the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, has been written out of some of the processes. Now, they're still there at the very end, especially when there is an objection or somebody wants to terminate the process. Why is this the case? Has this been discussed?
Yes, that's under on their decision. So we've asked them if they wanted to be a signature, and they politely declined and said that they would be an observer, and in the case of any type of conflict, then that's when they would fall in as what there really is, their true intent of being an advisor. So we have documents stating that they chose not to be a signature, but keep them informed and use them accordingly.
Well, it is good to hear that they will continue to be an observer, and they are always there for any issues that we have. This is something, unfortunately, that we found out too late after the first DEIS, when it was 11,000 pages long, and there was the regulation that they gave us 45 days. And so even though we had to ask for an extension and they provided an extension to 90 days, when I spoke to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, some of the upper management, they said that was, and of course this is informal, and it was years too late, but they said that was completely inappropriate. So please, if anything seems questionable, to bring them in for their national opinion.
Yes, John Mark himself is not afraid to use them. He uses them all the time. So.
Okay, so one of the things that could be something that we could be asking for, it seemed to me here, we are giving up something really important and really precious, and that's public input and interested party input. Now, I think we can push for interested party input and a certain amount of public input because that's a lot to give up. It streamlines the process, but as has been mentioned previously, we stood to gain a lot of things by listening to some of the public input. So with that, I'm hoping that in this PA that there may be opportunity to at least put it in there. Maybe it would not come to fruition, but as we've seen with other activities and other PAs, that if there is a discovery and it has the potential to have research conducted, to have it written and have it be shared, to have that information be shared, to have presentations, to have booklets, we're kept away from so much. To have access to at least the information of it, it's so precious. They talk about 16 sites. I struggled to see that the statement that there are no sites going to be impacted at NICTAMS, and yet it's a settlement. So I'm not quite sure how those two go hand in hand. But I would encourage having something like that in there. If in any case,
so
there's something that's discovered.
The constraint maps, once we get those are really pinpoint the exact locations within the confines of and how the proximity to a cultural resource or cultural site would be. So we're eagerly anticipating those to come through. I think that's gonna really pinpoint, spell out where things are going to happen, and you know, most certainly our office would be the first ones to jump in line and say, no, this is too close, move your training elsewhere or what have you. So, you know, that's what we're here for.
And those are for known sites, but as we've been seeing these many months, we're continuously being notified about inadvertent discoveries. So as I mentioned, I really, when I evaluate this, the loss of interested parties in the public to provide input in this process, it does streamline it, but I think that we should all be looking for ways to make sure that some of that does occur, that there is some way for interested parties, as has been mentioned, that they can continue to be part of the process, not just in the PA, but when certain types of discoveries or certain types of environments or sites, that they can come in and weigh in on some of that. There may be information that they can tell us about that type of a lifestyle, historic or ancestral, that hasn't been considered or may not be recognized in some way. So if we can continue to keep our thinking caps on as to where the right places might be, that we might still have some input, especially, let's say, from the Zoanti, right? They understand about these areas where they've been gathering medicinal plants for a long time. And so I think those would tend to come up from time to time. So there are some points here about making sure that Guam is included, and just those notes about terms where it talks about major training occurring. So just wanting to make sure that anything that is not specific has a definition. Like, what does that mean, major training? And do we only get documents and report if there's been a major training? I think that assessments and reports, even if it's telling us all the areas that did not have training or major training, are important to hear, that it makes everything comprehensive. It mentions here in the PA some different things that I had questions on, where it said, well, that there is going to be no construction. That was early on. And, you know, a lot of things change. So I hesitate to have us locked into that there's going to be no construction or no certain types of activities there. I mean, we've just heard that Singapore is going to be training here. And what does that mean exactly? So to look for areas like that, to make sure that there's some way to deal with it if indeed 9 years down the road there is going to be construction of some sort, or there is going to be earth moving or something of some sort.
Yeah, we're tracking that, Senator. We are actually discussing that today in the office, so we're definitely going to be bringing that topic up.
And I'd like to see some places here for SHPO concurrence, that if they have certain eligibility determinations, I believe I mentioned this before, but I just want to point it out again, that looking for those places where there is opportunity to push for concurrence.
Senator, if I could just
Yes.
add on that point, at the programmatic agreement workshop that we had at the Hilton, excuse me, that was brought up about so many points there where the SHPO concurrence had been there and then it wasn't there. And the explanation was that it is there in current other language. So I feel that they're streamlining it so much. I like seeing the duplicate language. And they said they're just pulling it out because it exists. But I don't think we should have to go digging through tons of regulations to find it. I like it repetitive in there. So that, Senator, what you're bringing up, what has been brought up at the programmatic workshop, and that's a point that we will continue to go back to, because when you see SHPO concurrence there and then it's gone, and then they say, oh, the SHPO always has it, it's just buried somewhere else. We want to unbury it.
I definitely agree. That was one of the general points that I had heard of as well. And so I want to put my voice in there as supporting that as well, that it just needs to be clearly spelled out each and every time, because we've all seen situations that happen, gaps, misunderstandings, non-clarity. Let's just keep it clear. I don't care if it gets a little bit longer and verbose. Like, clarity is the most important thing, because we want as few discrepancies as possible. So those are my major points. I just want to make sure that I mentioned, because I can't quite remember if I mentioned it specifically, but yes, I think I did, that we need to push for what's right for the people of Guam. And it doesn't matter if the federal government supports it, it doesn't matter if federal law supports it. We have to do what's morally right by the people of Guam. And if they hear it enough times, things can change. And at least it's on the record that we stood our ground. The only reason that Native Hawaiians, that Native Alaskans, that federal tribes have gotten what they have gotten is each and every one of them, to my understanding, have had to fight for it. It wasn't really given to any of them on a silver platter, but they had to insist on these things. And so I think they need to be consistently hearing from us what we feel is morally right to the people of Guam and the Chamorros whose homeland this is. So please continue to do that.
I'm totally in agreement with that.
And that's very good to hear. We have to ask for what's right, not necessarily what the law is willing to give us. Those regulations, they're faulty. They're trying to fix them. You can't necessarily regulate intent. You can only regulate certain letters of the law and check boxes that people can check mark off. And we've lost a lot from that because of those things like the language. The people of Guam, the SHPO, it will be taken into consideration. There's nothing absolute there. And we've seen a lot of that in our environmental impact statements. They took it into consideration, check mark is what it felt like at least, and then they chose the most damaging options. So I want our record to be as clear as possible that we all stood up for what was right. Siduos Masi, and I will pass it on to, back to the chair.
Senator Therese.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I would like to start off with some questions that I think that are overarching. And first of all, I just want to thank you guys for being here today. And it's important that we work together to protect our historic resources. It's very critical. So one of the overarching questions is, what are the lessons learned?
From the previous
programmatic agreements.
The lack of reporting, that was probably the most obvious one. And then what we've also noticed that, the constraint maps were, I don't know how old were they, but those have to be updated. So a lot of the data has to be updated. And then what we also implemented was the cultural sensitivity training that we're going to require that every soldier obtains prior to the exercise in line with any type of safety briefing that they have. I think that's critical too, so they have an awareness of what properties they're going to be entering, and what to look out for, and how to respect the location as well. And yeah, and we've also, and I think Chairman McKeel has a big part of this, is the inclusion of the traditional cultural practices, and which still, in some senses, have yet to be defined, but yet in line with what Senator Marsh was talking about is the uniqueness and the traditional cultural practices within our island, and implementing that within the programmatic agreement. So I think those are the major parts of the big differences between the two.
Senator, if I may, I have a previous engagement I am 20 minutes late for that was set 2 weeks ago. So if y'all will excuse me, if you have anything for me, direct it toward Patrick, and I will get back with you ASAP. Thank you.
Mr.
How timely, because the two comments I wanted to add to lessons learned. The review times for
Okay.
the SHPO's office and Guam's representatives, when something does happen to go awry, they haven't been great. I think that in the previous draft, they've improved it, but I think there's still room for improvement in terms of providing Patrick and his team with adequate time to really go back and study circumstances and come up with optimum solutions or recommendations or feedback. So there's still room for improvement. And that was something that was just not working well for Guam the first time through. And then the other question that we still haven't gotten through, and this is also an overarching thing, is having that sort of formalized agreement to support Patrick's office when they do become inundated with reports, and there's a lot of construction going on, and the team is running 5, 6, a dozen different sites and conditions and discoveries, and they're really just stretched too thin. So, it would be great if, and it may not be necessarily in this particular MIT discussion, maybe it's something that comes up a little bit later, but really formalizing the support for Patrick and his team, so they really, not only do they have adequate time to do the work, but they have the right staffing and resources in order to accomplish it properly. So those are two items that I think we'd really like to see improved on as we move forward. They've made some concessions in the recent drafts, but again, I think there's still room for more commitment and even a little bit more concession in terms of time. Okay.
So, in looking at, the Texan, that site was chosen after the programmatic agreement. Do you agree that that is one lesson learned in regarding the programmatic agreement being signed ahead of the project?
I definitely think that we didn't have adequate information, and it wasn't a fair situation to be put in, where we were obligated to comply with a condition without understanding the potential for that condition to really work against historic resources. And again, that's, in terms of it being a lesson learned, not just in this exercise, but in other programmatic agreements and other negotiations that we have, just to make sure that we've got a really robust language, and the conditions and the steps and the policies in place that favor Guam, and that we don't have to be tied necessarily to something that's really not working correctly. So we had the conversation a few moments ago about the ACHP and how, again, just my opinion, if the ACHP is called in on a timely basis, and the Guam team is able to inform them of all the repercussions that may or may not have been explained to them, that actually puts them in a better place to also participate in the preservation and protection of Guam's resources, historic resources. So, yeah, that is a lesson learned. It's probably one of the toughest ones we have to contend with, but it has to inform what we're doing moving forward.
Senator, for me, one of the lessons that I'm learning as I'm drilling through all of the different programmatic agreements, I'm not just looking at one, I'm looking at all of them. Because one time we went into a programmatic agreement workshop and the facilitators said, oh, we're taking this from something. That opened me up. As soon as they said they were taking something from some other agreement and putting it into this, then that just made me go look at everything. And the one that I'm trying to learn about is something that's in the 2011 agreement. And in the 2011 agreement is language. It just jumps out at me so much. It's language that DOD put money in there for roads, that they are going to take an appropriation, send it over to Federal Highway to pay for roads. So in here, it's all about the undertaking and military training and what to do and the qualifications on the historian and everything. And then right here, it's something about to authorize or carry out a variety of DOD projects identified, funded in whole or part by DOD. So we are going after, the government of Guam is going after 185 plus employees for our regulatory needs. And so my thinking and lessons learned is, when taking the advice of the senator, is to get outside of the box. If they took something that was important to them and stuck it in a programmatic agreement, they figured out a way to get DOD funding to highway so that they could build roads. Can we stick something in here into this one, or amend one of them, because go back and amend something and follow this pathway that they did? Ever since we're sharing here with you all that we're knowing and learning, so I really appreciate this opportunity. And so this is just brand new thinking on my part of what happened when I started to get off of this programmatic agreement and then go start looking at everything else. And it just jumps out at me, and I don't know what it means. And so I'm looking forward to getting into a room with our experts, military people, as well as our lawyers, and try to figure out, is this a viable pathway for something that's important to us? And I don't know, but it's a lesson that I'm trying to learn. What is it saying?
Yeah, so thank you. I appreciate you were mentioning earlier that the language has gotten more vague, and who does that serve? Whose benefit does that serve? And I don't think it's us. It's not our people. It creates a big hole that projects can go forward. And in looking at the Endangered Species Act, they have a process called reinitiation. So in the case that there are conditions where there are new conditions that have not been foreseen, there's a reinitiation that takes place. And so maybe in looking at the language in crafting this agreement, perhaps we can be informed by that process, where we reinitiate this programmatic agreement process for things that were not accounted for. And I think that helps to shift the balance back to protecting this historic properties that we never first saw was a problem. So, the other thing, I think the lesson learned is the unearthing of burials. There is nothing in that 2011 programmatic agreement that actually halted the project. Is this something that could be done with the programmatic agreement as far as halting the development upon unearthing of human bone fragments, and not just once, but was it?
Yeah, so
More
the
than-
MIT PA is not a development PA, it's a training PA. So there's no construction, there's no development, none of that's taking place with this programmatic agreement. So it's specifically for training, and if they were to construct or something that's related to training, then that's outside of the programmatic agreement, and they'd have to go through the regular Section 106 process. So this PA has no construction whatsoever.
So the other overarching question is, how can we develop proper safeguards to protect our historic properties?
I think we're in the process of putting those safeguards in, identifying first with the constraint maps. That's first and foremost to really know specifically down to the GIS pinpoint of the site itself, and then where within those parameters are the training plans. So, you know, we've brought up the topic of seeing their training plans, getting a history. That's why we've requested for data, and then also, you know, taking that history and then looking at what their plans are going to be within the next whatever. I mean, the military plans for 25 years, right? So they've got these future plans that they can pull from. So taking all of that and actually making sure that they avoid at all costs the cultural sites that have been identified within those constraint maps.
Do those constraint maps include noise disturbance?
It will not. It'll be specifically cultural resources.
Senator, some time ago, the Civilian Military Task Force came up with a list of needed legislation, and years ago it was identified that there would need to be noise abatement laws. So there's nothing precluding the government of Guam from yourself as policymakers setting noise abatement laws, and then they would have to abide by that.
Isn't noise disturbance considered a historic impact?
I'm not sure. I have to study that.
When looking at the studies that were done on the Tucson, a lot of effort was done in that regard as far as noise impacts. So considering that, would you adjust your constraint maps to include noise?
We'll take a look into that. I'll make a note of that.
The other thing is, you know, you'd mentioned that the programmatic agreement applies to known training events. So in regards to repeated use of the same type of training, do you consider that there's going to be a degradation of the environment? And
Yes.
how would you address that?
And that's part of the evaluation that we're going to be conducting. Hence the request for the historical data and then their training plans. So definitely looking at foot traffic, even vehicle movement within an area, is all being considered.
So is it conceivable that there'll be a drawdown of activity considering the increased cumulative impacts?
A drawdown of activity?
So, you know, with increased training, there should be, you know, one would expect cumulative impacts. Will this programmatic agreement address that and potentially request or require a drawdown of activity?
If it's going to impact the cultural resources, yes.
That's a phrase that we were all that's a phrase that we were all concerned about. That if new information comes in, training activities may be eliminated, reduced, or expanded based on new data, and that phrase is gone, which has raised concern by all of us. So we would want to put that back in to cover that.
Thank you. In regards to disturbed areas, so I've noticed in the draft PA, they mentioned that in one site, well, there's no, I believe in Haputo, if I can find it. No, sorry, Nictams. They basically, they omit that area. Basically, they said historic properties have not been located in training areas and no monitoring of historic properties is required. Do you concur with that statement, and why?
Again, it's gonna depend on the constraint maps and what part of NICTAMS that they're talking about, because it may not, the area that they're talking about may not be close to a cultural resource, even though it's within that base. So everything will, and what we'll do is we'll match the stipulations in section 4 with the constraint maps and really confirm, and validate what is stated here with what the constraint maps show us.
So how would you validate that historic properties have not been located in the training areas?
So the GIS will specify where the cultural resources are, and then the training plan identifies where they're going to be training at, and then we normally go, well, in most cases, a 30-meter radius closest to the cultural resource. So I'd have to get back to the actual distance of where the allotted, what they call the area of potential effect is with the site.
So when you talk about GIS, are you talking about intact cultural sites, or can that apply to other things?
For the most part, it's intact cultural sites, but not limited to. I mean, there's if they being archaeologists or whomever, cultural resource managers who are normally archaeologists, identify an area that's a cultural site, then they'll plot it.
What about in regards to disturbed sites where there's, a turning under of artifacts, bones, and other things?
Yeah, those are supposed to be plotted as well. But whether or not it stays in its original location or extracted for whatever reason, then it doesn't make sense to plot something that's not going to be there. And that's probably one of our long-term goals, is to actually go back and see if all the historical cultural sites are still there, or remove them, and if we're going to remove them out of the list, then why? What happened?
Yeah, because in Europe they show, if you look just like, not even a meter deep, you can see the history of the city based on the type of architecture that's under there. So, I mean, I would encourage you to think about, perhaps, even if it's disturbed, to preserve that, because that is a record of what was once there, even though it may have been disturbed.
Yeah, if I could, I think that does also fall in line with the intent of establishing the baselines and making sure that the territorial archaeologist and the crew in the SHPO's office is able to go out there and survey it until they feel confident that there's, it's unlikely that they're going to run into either undisturbed or disturbed historic resources. In either case, the SHPO's office has the option of entering into a discussion with whoever is hosting the activity to change or adjust that activity to move away from it. So the two steps, establishing the baseline and then having the SHPO and his team look at it to determine if they're comfortable with that activity happening in that location, and if there's historic disturbed or undisturbed content, then it's a fairly simple exercise to say you should find a different path for your training exercise.
So is that close to preservation in place? Is
I'm
there
sorry?
a bias towards preservation in place? Are you
Yes,
Are you
my-
describing that?
Personally, yes. You're asking me personally or in terms of this agreement?
Both, I guess, yeah.
Then the
both.
answer is yes.
Okay. And as far as the programmatic agreement is concerned?
Preservation in place is always the preference. It is always the best priority.
Okay, sorry, did you want to add something? One of the issues too that, the lessons learned is issues of monitoring. I don't know if you recall, in the annual workshops that there wasn't enough monitoring and projects were moving at full steam. What would this, in going forward, how would that be addressed as far as monitoring?
Again, there's no construction with this PA. So if in the event that there are movement of earth, so to speak, and then we're pretty much the locations that the exercises and trainings take place have already been surveyed, right? So the only time it's you're going to come up is if they, they go deeper than they're supposed to, and if that's possible, there's a probability, especially if there's high foot traffic, if it's not a paved area, they're going off of a dirt path. So there's probability there. So there's provisions, and I can't reference it right off the top of my head, but on inadvertent findings that's probable. What do they do is, again, it's going to go back into consultation with our office once they find something. And that is in one of the stipulations here. But we've identified that. It's not monitoring in the sense of what you're probably just talking about, like the live firing range, where they're clearing, large land. That's a different type of scenario than what we're talking about within the PA. So, like again, there's no construction, so there's no heavy equipment that's going to be going in there to be clearing any type of paths or anything.
And who's going to be doing the monitoring? And I think I read in the draft MIT that the monitoring can happen many days after the activity. Is this sufficient to ensure the preservation of that area? So I just have concerns about that.
Yeah, in the same line of how we are doing the monitoring now, it would be a requirement of the Navy to hire a SOI qualified individual or company that oversees any type of monitoring if that was going to be part of any type of mitigation plan.
And as far as timeliness, rather than wait many weeks after, is it possible to at least tighten that time frame?
If we're going to require monitoring, then they're not going to be able to go and exercise in that area until the monitoring is done. So, in that case, I guess the exercise would stop. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just a clarification. Are you talking about site visits and site verifications prior to the activity, and then monitoring of the activity, and then reviewing the baseline condition after the activity? Is that your reference?
Well, on page 4 of the draft MIT, it talks about limited training areas and monitoring historic properties. And so it says that it should be conducted within 30 calendar days following each major exercise. So it's my feeling that that's quite a long time frame. And it should be tightened, I feel.
Yeah, we'll look at that. I mean, it can be strengthened. We just want to make sure that it still works in the favor of the SHPO's office, not have it so that they trip on it.
Yeah, I'll have John Mark look at that. That's within his lane as far as when monitoring should be conducted post any type of activity. So I'll have him take a look at that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I in thinking about, what Senator Collado was saying, is that there's a part that was taken out in which there was a consideration as far as drawing down the activity. So I think it aligns with that effort. The other, lesson learned is public input. And I know my colleagues have mentioned that. And I just want to, reiterate that, considering Section 106 does require public involvement.
Right.
You know, what is the plan going forward to do this, to involve the public?
In this PA,
Yes.
so we'll make an announcement when the next consultation meeting is, and then somehow we can make this available with, I think this is a good product as far as what Joe has produced for people to kind of analyze side by side, you know. So unfortunately our website's not done, is not up. So if you guys are, will be, and we can put it in the, and we can, yeah. Correct. Okay, so they've offered the military build-up website and the governor's website as well. And then my email address, patrick.lujan@dpr.guam.gov. I'm open to any type of suggestions, recommendations. The last consultation meeting, I made that same offer, and so I'm still waiting for some solid suggestions to come into the PA.
If I could just add, and I know it sounds a little bit like a pest, but we just want to, I'm a big advocate for public outreach and getting feedback from the community and indigenous peoples as well. I think we just have to organize that, because I've had some conversations with you folks in the past that we have groups that are established for technical review. We have groups that are working on the legal review. We have groups that are talking about cultural value and taking the sort of the indigenous priorities forward. And when we meet with our representatives or with the representatives from the Navy, we just need there to be a little bit of structure so that each is able to completely communicate and attain their goals. Sometimes there's a lot of people in the room and some great opportunities don't get progress because there are a lot of voices at the same time. So just a word of caution. It's not, please don't take it out of context. It just,
Yeah, and I will promise you that every comment that's come through me, it's been vetted and brought forth to the table when we are in negotiation with them. So a lot of this that's here is not me, it's the team, it's everybody. All of your comments have been taken into consideration and shared, and for the most part, I would vouch that they've been receptive with heart, probably zero pushback on anything that we've asked so far. So, you know, if there's any other items that are within the parameters of and justifiable to be placed in, then please let me know so we can work on that and put it in.
I appreciate that. So is there also going to be a proactive measure where, in looking at other PAs, that interested parties could be identified and they could be mailed invitations or sent invitations? Is that something a way that you will be able to address this issue?
I plan to get the CNMI documents for our review so that we can look at that. I understand that other folks on our legal team have been looking at programmatic agreements in Hawaii. I've gone on the internet and I'm looking up other people's programmatic agreements to guide it. And the reason why I started looking at those programmatic agreements is to find anything that had like that language where DOD stuck appropriation language in it. And so I was trying to get some scale and perspective from other PAs. So definitely looking all around, near and far.
Thank you.
could I add?
Sure.
Yeah, so from the Guam Preservation Trust side, you folks are familiar with the Asian and Pacific Islanders and Historic Preservation Organization, which was really instrumental when we were working on the Paget project. So we plan to make this information available to them. They're a really big advocacy group. As well, you may already know that we've been in communication, very regular communication with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who are also providing a lot of feedback and pointers. So they have groups that are also looking at the documents and giving us feedback and pointers. because they've worked with, programmatic agreements and with the military and all over the nation. And so we're using that also as a resource.
That's great. So going back to soliciting public input, is there going to be a mail out to potential interested parties? Is there going to be an active, proactive measure in that regard?
Can we email them instead of mail out, or?
Oh, yeah, emailing is.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. In regards to reporting, so in regards to updating the constraint maps and the other information, so information is going to be shared with the Guam SHPO prior to finalization. Would it be possible to also include the oversight chair, the Guam Historic Preservation Board, in reviewing any type of study surveys? Is this something that could be included in the programmatic agreement? Or
Yes,
something that you will-
I've made it a common practice where pretty much the core here and the chairwoman have been part of my distro list with the MIT, so I intend to keep doing that.
What about the involvement of the ACHP?
So the ACHP is CC'd on what we're doing as well. They have not come back to say anything just yet. We haven't addressed anything directly to them, but we are keeping them in the loop with common courtesy copies.
Okay. And then also about...
And National Park Service, sorry, because they had requested that they are in the loop as well. So I've been giving them courtesy copies too.
Okay. What about the any plan of action that's going to be detailed in the programmatic agreement regarding non-compliance? So so in addition to writing in the agreement, monitoring, and should there be non-compliance, what would be the plan of action and how would that be detailed in the programmatic agreement?
I can tell you I've had different conversations with legal counsel who have up at Adelup that have expressed a desire to look deeper into that section, and I understand that that's probably discussions they're having with the Attorney General's office that will be working with us on that. So part of the reason for the legal review is to have them take a look at it and tell us if they are satisfied with the remedies or the procedures and processes in place for non-compliance, and we may get back strengthening language, suggestions, and recommendations. But the Attorney General's office and the Governor's office are engaged. We're getting legal help.
It's good to hear.
SHPO's getting legal help.
It's good to hear. In regarding so baseline data, would you say that is there a difficulty in getting that information?
It should not be difficult. I think their surveys on base have been fairly robust. I'm not quite certain, but I'm gonna think that it's fairly robust, and it's just a matter of gathering that data. We have some within our office, and so we're trying to see if there's anything that has newly acquired data from their side. So again, it all hinders on what comes in, and hopefully it comes in by the end of the month.
Do we have a record of annual workshops that came from the 2009 MERC PA that could be used as part of that baseline data?
There were no reporting requirements, so there was no annual meetings, or that's why we are putting it in the upcoming one.
That's a big loss of information. The other thing, are you going to develop cumulative impact indicators that can be used?
We should. Yeah, I mean, it should be a part of this. I'm not sure if it's specifically laid out, but with the annual reporting requirement, it would be a part of all the training data based off of out of that year. So I anticipate that to be part of it.
What about using nomination of historic sites? So one of the things that I see in a lot of these projects is that it may impinge upon another historic site. Can that be used as an indicator of cumulative impact?
It would, but that's something in the forefront that we should be able to catch instead of as the years go by. So that's why the baseline surveys and the constraint maps are vital right now before we proceed.
Okay. And then a question about the interim PA. Who were the consulting parties in that one?
So right now it's the National Park Service, and as invited signatory, I don't know what the proper term is, but GPT is also involved in it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Senator Marsh, Titan.
Seduce Masi, Madam Chair. So if I could ask Mr. Makio of the Guam Preservation Trust, well, sorry, let me restate that. The chair of the Historic Preservation Review Board. This is in relation to the Guam Preservation Trust and some of its activities. So at NICTAMS, I know that there's been discussion back and forth about keeping a memorial site inside the gate and then having a visitor center outside the gate. Can you let us know, the last I had heard, there was no confirmed yes. And so could you let us know if there has been any confirmation or agreement to that?
The Guam Preservation Trust is currently working with representatives from the Cultural Resource Management Office for Joint Region on an interpretive center. So they have set aside property that's on the public side of the entrance for the proposed base, and we've been communicating with them about different forms of interpretive and display areas to be used in that site. So the last communication that we had was to actually expand the space that they had set aside, and I believe that they're looking positively at that. We're still working through concepts and ideas of what we want to place in that location, but it does loop around back to what we had talked about earlier here today about disturbed finds and pottery and what we would call the historic resources that were left behind, and trying to gather that those resources in a structured way. So we don't just want a bag of resources or pottery artifacts. We'd like there to be some structure to identify potential periods, quantities, locations, configurations, and maybe even some anthropological background to go with that, and have that level of information and the resource provided to us so that we can make that available to tell the story of the settlements in that location and make that available for people. So it's going actually pretty well. They've been they've responded positively to our requests and our ideas. So it hasn't been formalized yet, but it's heading in that direction.
Okay, so it hasn't been formalized, meaning that they have not committed to absolutely having this interpretive center.
No, they haven't. There's no documentation, establishing it. What we have had is Guam Preservation Trust brought on a consultant, and the consultant brought forward, I think, 3 different options for how to treat the site. We've talked those over, and we've actually expanded it now to include plants, outdoor displays, indoor displays, dioramas, things of those nature. So, and because we're working with the cultural resource team there, we feel that it's moving in the direction of a commitment. So,
I think it's been going on for 1 to 2 years. I would have liked to have seen a commitment on their part by then. Does this mean that the memorial site that was proposed is not moving forward in a positive manner?
The original memorial site that we were looking at was the site 2303. Sorry if I refer to it in that way. But that didn't, the calendar on that just didn't work in our favor. So the SHPO's office wasn't able to secure the site, and we weren't able to get that as the memorial site. But we have expressed to them that, again, preservation in place is still our priority, and where sites are discovered, we'd really like to move quickly towards protecting the resources.
So there was a potential Laddie Quarry site, and that was my preference for a memorial site because it's an actual site, and it helps tell part of the story. The Lati are there at the South Finnegadson housing area, and then the quarry site is there, and then the interpretive. It seemed like it would really help tell that bigger story. So the reason I've been asking this is we've been talking about looking for ways to make sure that we're strengthening this PA agreement. And we're giving up a lot to put in that public input, to give up having interested parties. The way that these PAs have gone in the past is you have to be a concurring party, and most organizations that I know of that are interested do not feel comfortable with that term concurring, that they have to agree to the programmatic agreement in order to provide input. So we're giving up a lot. And I think there's value to that, and that there should be some balance to that. I'm pushing for, and other senators here are pushing for, that we find ways to make sure that interested parties can still be participating, that we're not giving up all of our rights, and that others can participate as well. But so I'm looking towards, maybe this is one of the things that we can put into the programmatic agreement. I mean, after all, we're talking about cultural resources, right? And to say that this absolutely will happen, and that maybe we could even re-look at the possibility of a memorial site. There has to be some sort of trade-off there. We've given up a lot of sites already from these early developments, if not these current developments.
Yeah, if I could comment, the process that we're in for the interpretive site was, it was a good start, and we're learning how to communicate ideas and priorities for items like a memorial site. So I think it's a great idea, and I think we should put some energy into pursuing that particular site moving forward. We have to study and figure out how to put some teeth into it relative to agreements. I think we're also kind of shifting back and forth between the larger programmatic agreement and the MIT, but I see the point of what you're saying, and I agree with it. It's a good idea.
Right. Even with the MIT, there are going to be training activities there. So, I mean, in my mind, that's what triggered that. And then if I could just find out real quickly, because I just want to make sure that language is in there from the SHPO, is the ability to ask for extensions in there? We've been talking about if there are these inadvertent discoveries and if you have only 30 days and who knows what all might be happening at the exact same time. Is that language in there? Is it necessary for the PA?
So with my experience so far, it's a flex. You know, if we needed another week, then it's normally granted. We have though offset the dates from, if you see a lot of the references of 14 days, we allotted us more time to review any type of findings, where the other PA only gave us 2 days to make a, you know, to review it, and that's just not enough time at all. So we did take that part of the lessons learned and carried it over to this to give ourselves at least 14 days for review.
So I guess I would just maybe formalize the ability to extend, especially given certain circumstances, so that that's just considered a standard possibility.
Yes, and that was, you know, John Mark is in agreement with that's sufficient time.
So Saina Maasi, Madam Chair, for letting me ask a couple other questions.
Okay, Senator Paris, I also have some, but please proceed. And then,
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just thought of a couple more questions. Please bear with me. So I remember in one of the talks, there was mention that they were touting, the military was touting the historical district in Naval Base. What is your understanding of that, the existence of historical districts in the Naval Base Guam? Yes. I believe it was Al Borja was mentioning that there is very significant historical resources, and that it was seen as a district. Do you concur with that?
maybe a cultural landscape.
I think you
There-
used the
there
term
was a-
district.
Media piece that was done on the historic sites near and around Naval Magazine. Is that what you were
Yeah.
thinking about?
I believe, well, I don't recall
Right.
the exact site.
So I think there's a good understanding that there are historical resources there. There are several registered pieces there. I think the review board had looked at it several times because we feel that the problem is that they weren't looking at it like a district. They were looking at it like individual historic sites, and we had wanted them to tie that together and treat it more like a settlement or a village, or not just individual elements that were historic in nature. So I would like to, in our next meeting with the review board, to invite, Al Borja usually attends that, and there's been a lot of encouragement from the review board for the Cultural Resource Management team and Al to really start advocating for that as a district and not treating it like an individual site. I actually feel like they support the idea. I'm just not sure they understand how to navigate it within the bureaucracy of the military. So, but I think it's a specific point that we should bring up with them, because relative to the training program, things can go wrong when you look at it as individual sites and people are moving in between them. Whereas when you're looking at a district, you understand that it's a larger area, and it includes things like traditional cultural properties. So when they go to map out a potential training area, they look at that historic space differently than they would if they were looking at it as individual sites. So there's sort of we have a standing agenda item for discussions with the cultural resources officers, such as Al, who also updates us on the required nominations that the Joint Region has to put forward as part of the other programmatic agreement.
Thank you. And then the other thing, in looking at creating this programmatic agreement, are there opportunities to develop a cultural resource program that considers successional planning for the Historic Preservation Office? Is there an opportunity that exists for such a thing, for programs for successional planning, so that we have a steady stream of cultural, historic preservation staff?
As far as personnel, or?
Yes, and yeah.
Haven't thought about that for this programmatic agreement, but something to discuss.
Okay, and then the other thing is, on page 2 of the draft MIT, it talks about, the Department of Interior standards for hiring, I think, archaeologists and other professionals. Is there a way to include more of an indigenous perspective for those professionals?
Yeah, so I'm going to look into it more, but I just read something recently that National Park Service is now recognizing indigenous knowledge in the same level as any type of SOI type of qualifications. So at least it's getting to that level where the Park Service is starting to recognize that, how important and valid that type of knowledge someone carries.
That's good to hear.
Senator, I was impressed by language on page 3 to your question. Under D, there's just this one phrase, it's new language, but not necessarily be limited to. So the way that I read that was, it was saying that everybody should have these qualifications in order to work in historic preservation experience and satisfactory prior. But that phrase, by being inserted there, but not necessarily be limited to, I felt that that is language that allows for somebody who has this indigenous knowledge, cultural knowledge, that we could value that, and that's an opportunity to be inserted there. And this is new language. So that definitely jumped out at me. And I was pleased with that.
Can I also add, so at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, National Park Service had several sessions that were held by a tribal cultural officer. And it was really interesting. He told the story of how their organization came to be. So they were formed by their own tribal law, and then that individual is tasked and, for lack of a better word, either appointed or elected into that role. And his job is through the year to bring issues and topics that affect federal interaction with that particular tribal group, to be the conduit for discussion backward and forward, so back and forth between the two organizations. So it's challenging to have an individual who's tasked with that, but it's maybe something that you folks can, from the legislative branch, can start considering how to form and formalize an individual in maybe some capacity, and then but also to fund an office so that they have the resources to go out and communicate with the groups, bring that information back, and then become the point of contact. And by the way, that individual that I was speaking with also had cultural resource planning, and he was an anthropologist. He was a cultural anthropologist, so, and a member of the tribe. So it's something to consider. It makes it easier for that individual to exist and be serving the community already when we come into discussions like this. Yeah.
Thank you. Just one more question. So would it be possible to get the methodology for the baseline assessment?
I will request that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I guess I want to just go back to the beginning again. And if we remember the scale of what we're talking about here, this Mariana Islands Training and Testing Area encompasses the entire archipelago plus oceans that I think at the time when it was first announced was described as the largest training and testing area in the world. And what I want to do here by bringing a public hearing, asking you to answer these questions, asking you to increase the public input into this process is we have a very unique opportunity. And this is a unique opportunity for Guam. We're not an agency out in, a state or even a small entity where we're going to be impacted. We're an entire island. We're actually an entire archipelago that will be impacted by live fire training. Live fire. It's also very unique. This does not happen in most places at all. But the fact that it's been happening for 10 years, I think, I also want to remember that in the past 10 years, the scale of activity is nothing like what we may see. They've already predicted that they will increase. They were already permitted for at least 12,500 detonations per year, every year. That's what the permits allow, 12,580 detonations. And so there are reports, come back to us and tell us they didn't do that many, right? It also allows for sonar, and we're not even talking about the sonar here because they've concluded in their SEIS or their EIS that sonar use does not impact historical properties. So we're not talking about the sonar use today. But we're talking about this number of detonations and maybe more, because that's specifically the change that they're asking for, to increase in certain areas this types of training and testing. So all these impacts to the property that we're describing that, they're just, what looks like normal use may really change. Or, I just think we have to consider that the scale of what we're looking at is actually something that we might not have ever seen before. The other thing is that, it was described earlier that each of us, we have our roles, and we're going to all get into our roles, but this is not a bureaucratic task. I really hope we can look at this with big picture in mind. That's what I'm really trying to push, and we need to do it with all of us, but we also have to know that this is a negotiation. And I don't know, but in negotiations, we were trained in law school. You don't give things away prior to your negotiation, and you don't give things away piecemeal in a negotiation. I mean, until you're ready, until you know exactly what you want, and you make sure that you're not going to get you're not going to undersell yourself in these negotiations. And I don't believe, despite any individual's capabilities here, that any one of us can negotiate this successfully for Guam by ourselves. None of us has that type of expertise, and I truly believe that a SHPO, despite their total power in this type of negotiation to represent Guam, you can ignore everything I have to say and go in there and do whatever you want. But I am suggesting that it is the people of Guam, it is their support, their objections that are really the most powerful thing that we have to use in our negotiations. And so when Senator Carlotta pointed out that there are some PAs, and I've looked at many PAs also, because it is our duty to do that. If we are going to go in there and negotiate the best deal that we can get for Guam, then we better know what is available to us. What are the other good deals that have happened? I'm sure that that's what the CNMI is looking for. They are looking to get a better deal. They are, FDM is part of the CNMI, That's what they want. They want the bombing, right? They want that ability, the military wants that ability to bomb. So it's a huge, it's a different situation for them. But as I said, when we get divided up, then we really lessen the cumulative impacts that Guam faces. Or, I think we artificially say that we are not going to be impacted by what's going on, the live fire that's going on in the CNMI. I think that's artificial. I think that's actually wrong. And I respect the CNMI for whatever the purposes they are going for the separation. I totally respect that because I think they are going for the negotiation, the best deal that they can get. And we're talking about things like in the relocation PA, the cumulative effects were so large, so not able to be calculated, but they were recognized to be large. The EIS said that the cumulative impacts were huge. And look at this. This is a huge training and testing area. I think we should not underestimate those cumulative impacts. And those cumulative impacts is what got us we were able to negotiate a repository. We were able to negotiate other things, like we were supposed to get a museum. The military has come back now and reported to us that they tried and they were not able to get the funding for it. And the PA, the language says, they need to attempt to do this. And so I hope we've learned from that too, right? That language means everything. So I'm absolutely for all the review that we can get, but we're talking about, before we review the words, you need to come from a big picture. You need to know we want to negotiate. This is one of the few things we can actually use to negotiate impacts to Guam. Now, we want to avoid impacts, and I think we absolutely need to strengthen our language, because that's the number one lesson I have learned from all these other PAs, is that when they say avoidance is our number one priority, that's not at all evident from the actions. It's unless we can't, right? We avoid unless we can't, and who determines unless we can't? They do. We don't. I think that was a huge mistake. And if we can fix that in our negotiation, those are the big things we need to fix. Who's deciding whether it can be avoided or not? It's supposed to be that our SHPO is so powerful, they can come in and say, no. You can do that all over Guam. You can say, no. You must avoid this impact. But for some reason in these negotiations, we're not able to do that. We've actually lost access to go and inspect these properties whenever you want to. This is, it's actually gotten worse than it ever was. Our ability to inspect whenever you want to, you've got to make all these prior arrangements. That's not how you regulate us, I know that. You are able to get out to my property and look if I'm digging up something anytime you want to. That's the power that we've given to the SHPO. And I want our negotiation for the government of Guam, for all the people of Guam, to show that we value our historic resources. We are going to insist that you avoid them. And the problems that I'm having is that for the PA since 2009, it did require, I think, an annual review of the training, at least. That never occurred. And as you said, there were no reports. We know nothing. For 10 years, they've been doing training and testing. We don't know what the impacts were. Because nothing has come up, we're led to believe that there's been no other historic site discovered in this entire training and testing area. And I just find that very difficult to believe, based on even at the last meeting, the DOD representative archaeologist said Guam, all of Guam is what did he say? It's a historic property, right? Cultural landscape. And it is. And as Mr. McKeo described, they've tried another thing in the PAs, if they tried to treat this as separate projects, separate properties, separate sites versus entire villages, versus entire landscapes, versus the plateau that they use to feed the village below. Things like this. We've seen this over and over. And so while we need to do our detailed reviews, we also need to be able to negotiate. And that's what I'm trying to do, Mr. Lujan, is because we are pretty much at your mercy in negotiating this thing, I want to empower you. I want the people of Guam to advise you. I think we would be foolish to think that we know more about any of these properties than everybody else. This is why in Hawaii, they don't just let one person, but they have a council of indigenous knowledge that they bring to these types of consultations. And so I am looking for you to do a lot more when it comes to these consultations. You know, I put myself in this process. So informing me, that's great. And informing the senators, I'm trying to inform all the senators by calling hearings like this so they can all be informed. But really, yeah, I think we need the people. Like I said, in that 2010 negotiation, it was them who were, that's why they didn't sign in the end, because they wanted even more. We came up with beautiful lists of things that should be included, that should not be touched. And believe me, I'm sure if the firing range at Northwest Field had been announced at that time, that would have gone very differently. At the time, they were only talking about Paget, and so it was the public that was able to help the SHPO to negotiate Paget out of that entire arrangement. And other things. So I wanted to just say very quickly some of these things, like I don't want to go through all the details with you and the PA that you've negotiated so far, but I do think that, you know, there are options. And so one of them is suggested by Mr. Dave Lotz, who has also submitted his testimony. And he, you know, had much experience. He's one of the Historic Preservation Review Board members. He also has many years of experience in consultations, state historic preservation work. And I'm not going to read his entire letter, but it's available to you. I've passed it out to all the senators. But what it says is that there is no requirement for a programmatic agreement. There is a federal legal requirement for a review of military training actions under Section 106. At the last meeting held on October 30, 2019, the Navy opened the meeting by presenting a draft programmatic agreement with the statement that, quote, "we are at the refined language state," unquote. However, it is quite evident that the Navy has failed to adequately address the required initial basic steps of determining the undertaking, identifying historic properties, and assessing adverse effects. And he makes citations to the Historic Preservation Act for all these requirements. Therefore, it's clearly premature and contrary to law to even consider any agreement, as we do not even know what the proposed training is, the cultural resource in the training areas, and the impact on our heritage resources. Guam has no obligation to further continue any discussion of this proposal and should insist that the requirements of law be followed to ensure that our cultural resources are adequately protected. We need to be assertive and effective in our negotiations with the Navy regarding the protection of our cultural resources. Furthermore, we should insist on transparency and that the meetings of the Navy be open to the public and the press, and we need to have subsequent discussion on what are the appropriate treatments for preserving our heritage. Now, when it comes to transparency, that's Mr. David Lotz. But when it comes to transparency, and we've talked about this as an improvement, I guess, from the last PA, which had no public input at all on the MERC. But really, I don't think we're laying out a very convincing process for transparency when the meetings that have been called by the Department of Defense are, Senator Carlotta was describing them as workshops, but when you read the Department of Defense letters, which I have over and over because they're very, very clear that they are describing these as consultations, and that they also write that they are at the end pretty much of their consultation process. And I'm alarmed because they've announced the meetings, we've not invited many people, and they, you know, they're, as far as they're concerned, they've heard from everything they need. And they're getting, I guess, the agreement edited or changed satisfactory to them. But I just think that I'm hoping that I agree with Mr. McKee also that Guam can do so much better than this. Guam needs to organize ourselves, try to do this. We need to organize ourselves. And we need to empower you as a SHPO, the signatory, to go in there and negotiate for us the best deal that we could all collectively come up with. And I really am praying that politics does not have a role in here. This is bring the best minds, bring those who love these places the most, and let them come and educate us and empower us to get the best deal that we can. If you look from what was required of them in 2009, what they have done, not much. And yet we are going forward as if we trust them to produce, and I kind of think that's my colleague's point was in showing what happened at Magua. What they say they're going to do and what really ends up being done is not really, it's not evident, right? They don't match. When they say they're going to report, we've got no reports. We've got the 10 years worth of baseline versus impacts, none. And we're trying to catch up now. But one thing I also wanted to make a point with, and this is in regards to, you know, maybe we're short of resources on our side. Well, this is the opportunity to take advantage of, they want this PA because this this agreement is going to allow them to get the permits that they really want, to allow them to continue their activity. Otherwise, they'd have to put their activities on pause, and otherwise they'd have to, you know, consult with you one by one and really disclose all their activities and then disclose the impacts. It's I think, much more transparent process that way. And I understand you want an agreement that would make it more convenient for you, but when it comes to transparency, I think the individual might be more transparent. But because we are, we're dealing with a David and Goliath situation here, us, Guam, with our limited resources, trying to keep up with this huge, unprecedented activity. I think what we can do is use this time right now. Before you agree to an agreement, this is the time to make sure that the surveys are done, to make sure that the assessments are done, that all of that is done in advance, that if we require additional surveys, that they be done now. And in other words, try to foresee inadvertent discoveries, or, to take care of as much as that as you possibly can. And I don't think there's been much or any action on that at all in the last 10 years. Meaning, I saw a letter that was written by the former SHPO in January when they began this process, this consultation, and she laid out several things. She said the probability maps were based on outdated surveys. Those were the maps that they used back then. So between then and now, they've not been updated. She says the stipulation 16 meeting states that from the execution of this PA, all signatories shall meet at 5-year intervals to determine if any amendments were needed. There were no meetings. I'm just showing these as examples of their obligations that they did not meet. So we should not go into a negotiation totally believing that they're going to meet their obligations. I think if you can require everything up front, that's how you ensure that we get these, that's how you ensure that we know everything we want to know before they even begin a training. We know all the training they want to do. I hope I'm making myself clear, but I do have a couple particular questions, big picture again. So they've told us no sites have been discovered since 2009, no inadvertent discoveries, no human remains in this training and testing period. they don't talk about, I think this training and testing impacts traditional fishing grounds, and I'd like you to address that in this PA much more, like to list them as, we talked about this in some of our meetings, as, you know, historic properties, cultural practices. I wanted to find out if this MIT includes the joint training exercises that we hear announced quite often between Japan, Australia, the US. Are those joint training exercises covered by this MIT? Yes? Yeah, those exercises, when they're announced, we really get very little detail. Like I think the media has tried to get detail from them, and we really don't. But those are huge exercises, and I expect many more. And then recently they announced in the news that Singapore the U.S. has allowed Singapore to establish a permanent facility here to conduct training. And do you think that is covered by this MIT?
We're not too sure, but we're going to discuss that with them.
Yeah, I'm concerned about things like this, like things that we haven't foreseen, but that they are going to start trying to include as part of training and testing activity. Mm-hmm. And I can only see it increasing. I mean, I can see it increasing alarmingly because the Marines aren't here yet. When they, and this is all planned not just for international training, but also for their training. And I just expect more and more of it. That the U.S. is using Guam, it's very clear, as a place to do training and testing. That's their negotiating chip with these other countries. Come to Guam, they love the ability to bomb because they don't get to do that anywhere else. And I hate to say it, but I heard that, from people casually. And so I can understand, I'm just saying, please, this is our only opportunity to do this. We're not going to get many more. The other PAs, they don't expire for a while. This is the only opportunity we're going to get in a long while to have input into the types of activity, especially live fire, that they're doing, the cumulative effects of those things, and to negotiate the best that we can get for Guam.
Senator, if I could just add on the point that you were making a moment ago, on page 2, at the very bottom of the page, the language that was removed from this sentence was, before it said the senior military official in the 36th Wing and other DOD units training within are responsible for complying. That phrase, and other DOD units, has been removed. And so that triggered me to think, what about allied units? Mm-hmm. What about our allies? If we're taking out the language that says other DOD units, then that just made me think. So it's along the same lines.
Thanks.
Of inserting in here allies. And as the SHPO was saying, as we're pushing through the legal review, every single thing like this is jumping out at us. Because as these missions state, it's amphibious assault, these exercises, et cetera. We know that Australia, Japan, Korea, other countries, allies, Singapore, participate. So we want to ensure that language is inserted there that will be strengthening Guam's positions about the concerns we have with how they conduct themselves while they're here.
Thank you. And I know that, we're all, part of what, Guam is facing is a lot of things shift. Every 4 years, the governor shifts, senators shift, SHPO shifts. We've seen SHPO shifts. And that's why I brought that up in the very beginning also, right? So in the 2009, the SHPO was even pushed out of the picture, and there was a director signing this. And I don't want to speculate, but, I just don't want to see politics. I want to see that we are all doing our best, and that we all appreciate that none of us knows enough, I think, to negotiate this fully for Guam, and that we can, keep welcoming input.
May I?
Sure.
So, no, appreciate all that scolding
It's not a scolding, Mr. Lujan. See, maybe you don't understand what I'm trying
I'm
to
just
tell
saying.
you, because that's not a scolding. There are things I want to scold about, but I'm not even going there.
Well, I think we've made a lot of progress with this PA. To be honest with you, I think I've been very open to the senators and the stakeholders. If there's more stakeholders that want to get involved, they're more than welcome to get involved. I'm taking all aspects and suggestions, and a lot of this that's in here are suggestions. They're the details that, I mean, for example, what Ms. Carlotta was saying, I see it differently as far as taking out some provisions, because it's already understood that your JRM commander and the 36th Wing commander are the responsible parties of these bases. So whoever falls within these bases, that's the one that's going to be responsible. So it doesn't make sense to put everything else down on that. So that's just one thing. But man, I think we've been working well with each other and coming up to this. And
Well,
so
my
and
concern,
so
Mr. Lujan.
I get the point of and I don't. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm all for the one Guam concept. I believe we're having another workshop this week.
Consultation.
No,
This week?
I thought it was Friday at 2:00.
What's that?
For us, for our group
Oh.
to get together. So, let's just keep working together and come up with a good product. And I agree with everything you say but we are moving and working together really well, I believe. So I just,
Well, Mr. Lujan, when you say that, it just reminds me of, for example, I thought we were going to approach this with let's get Guam's wish list, right? Let's get what we want. Let's get our language for those things. Let's get that all ready, and then let's go into negotiations. And several people in the Historic Preservation Review Board have said this in different ways. And then when I see a letter that says, this is the draft, we've already made these changes, we've already negotiated away a combined PA, we've already negotiated away whatever these items are that Senator Carlotta was listing, that type of thing, it just doesn't give us confidence that we're not going to see again another PA that is just negotiated without our input. And that has happened, and that's really what leads this whole thing, is we do not want that to happen again. We want to be sure that we can all, be proud of what we have negotiated, and we can all help to enforce that. And that we're all not going to be, stuck here without the ability to stop them digging up any more human remains, right? Or to stop them from removing Magua from the face of the earth, and now letting us settle for a totally, outside the fence, new site memorial area. If we can preserve these things in place, that's our job. That's what we want to do. And we need to work together to do that. We can't be giving things away in negotiations, I think, until, I don't know, I'm not going to tell you how to negotiate in public, but it's just common sense. You don't give your stuff away in negotiation until you need to, right? And I think we could do a better job at being transparent. And I appreciate your cooperation with us, your answering to our questions. It's just, you've announced that you want to conclude this as quickly as possible. You want to conclude it by March. You've also announced that you've received nothing that was supposed to be done as part of the original 2009 MERC up to now, and that we are still requesting these things, we're still waiting for them, and then we're going to review them while we've already got a document that's close to final. And that's your words, not mine. And so that's why I'm concerned, because those just don't sound consistent to me. So this is not a scolding. I'm begging you to work with the community. And despite the power that has been given to you to be the sole signatory on this document, to work with the entire community to negotiate what is best for Guam. That's what I'm asking.
Okay.
May I?
Mr.
Well,
McKee.
thank you for your comments. I think you've given us a lot to think about. You always do. You're a very passionate person, and I appreciate that. So we need to sit down and just kind of gather ourselves. There's nothing combative about coming into this conversation. And I think if you could work with us to just give us some time to gather ourselves and get oriented, that would really help, and it would help us keep the communication lines nice and open and keep us moving along the right lines. I think from the board side, I think we're going to encourage Patrick to, and he already knows this, that until the substantive information is received from the military, that, you know, it really is going to set the pace of what does or does not happen. That's a given. I think the next step that I'm really eager to hear about is going to be what the legal review and the Attorney General comes back with, because that really is going to tell us where the phrasing is going to go, how to emphasize this correctly to get to some of the points that you're talking about. Yeah, so those are all part of this process. And I mean, I think nobody here is objecting to anything that you're proposing. We just come to it from our different backgrounds, and there's processes that we all go through. So again, I think, you know, it would be great if once we get the legal language and the feedback and the ideas from the Attorney General's office, I think that really is going to set a lot of things in motion. And again, I don't foresee any action coming until the information that we've requested comes from the military. And you know, lastly, I think, you know, there's nothing wrong with us sending a letter back to our counterparts that in this negotiation and saying, you know, just be aware that the progress is not moving much further beyond where you are today unless this information is provided. And these are the steps that we're expecting to fall in line. So if you support us through those steps, I think we're all going to go through, you know, that together, and it'll set the remainder of our path in place. And whether it's, you know, 3 months or 6 months or even more, that is really for us to collectively make a determination on. So, thank you.
All right. Right, so I appreciate that, and I appreciate all of your efforts. I know we're all working very hard on this, and that we've all seen, you know, what really, some mistakes. We've seen some good things, we've seen some good parts, and we just want that. And I just think information is going to drive that, so let's push for that information up front, everything you can get, so that you don't have to scramble later. We're not all scrambling later to try to stop something that's a steamroller already. But again, Mr. Lujan, thank you very much. Senator Carlotta, thank you. And Mr. McKee, thank you. And to all of those, the Guam Preservation Trust did excellent work. And so I thank you for all of that. Sidus Masi. This hearing's concluded. It's about 8:15 p.m. Thank you.